There were always 91 tags on the board, and we only ever had 90 children. That's the whole thing, really. Everything else I am going to tell you is decoration around that one fact. And I have spent 19 years failing to decorate it well enough for anyone to understand why it kept me awake. My name is Farron. I was the waterfront director at a place called Camp Ondaska for 6 summers, from the age of 24 to the age of 30, and I have not been swimming in fresh water since. Ondaska sat on the western arm of a lake called Marne Water, in the kind of country where the road stops being a road about 2 miles before you arrive and becomes a suggestion of gravel between 2 walls of spruce. 400 acres, 11 cabins, a dining hall built in 1931 out of logs that had been standing on the property the year before, a chapel nobody used for religion, and a waterfront that was, I will say this without embarrassment, the most beautiful place I have ever worked. The lake was spring-fed and cold and clear at the edges, and then about 40 feet out, it simply stopped being clear. Not murky. Dark. The bottom drops off Marne water in a way that has to do with glaciers and does not have to do with anything else. And the drop is close in. And if you swam out past the second dock and looked down, you were looking at nothing at all. The state survey lists the maximum depth as 194 feet. The people in the town of Marne Crossing, 9 miles away, will tell you it has never been measured. In the morning, before the campers were up, the lake would have a mist on it that sat about 3 feet above the surface and did not move because there was no wind at that hour. And I would walk down the hill with my coffee and my clipboard, and I would stand at the end of the dock, and there would be no sound at all except the loons. I want to be fair to that place. I loved it. 6 summers, and I loved every one of them, and I would go back tomorrow if I could go back to a version of it that did not have the board in it. Here is how the buddy system worked at Ondaska, and I need you to understand it in detail, because the detail is the horror. Every camper had a wooden tag, round, about the size of a coaster, cut from birch by a maintenance man in the 50s, and recut over the years as they cracked. Each tag had a number burned into one side. Each camper was assigned a number for the session, and their name went on a laminated key sheet at the guardhouse. The board was a sheet of plywood on the dockhouse wall, painted with 2 large fields, out and in. Each tag hung on a nail. You came to the waterfront, you moved your tag from in to out, you swam, you left, you moved it back. Every 20 minutes, on the whistle, everybody in the water stopped and found their buddy and raised joined hands. And my staff counted pairs, and then I counted tags on the outside, and the 2 numbers had to match. If they did not match, we cleared the water and we searched. This is a good system. This is, honestly, the best system anyone has come up with. It has one flaw, which is that it counts tags and not children. And for 5 summers, that flaw was theoretical. In my 6th summer, it stopped being theoretical. The first session of that year was the last week of June. 90 campers, which was our capacity, so all 90 numbers were in use, 1 through 90. On the 3rd day, at the 11 o'clock buddy check, I counted 45 pairs in the water and 46 tags on the outside. That is a normal problem. It happens constantly. A child gets out to use the bathroom and forgets to flip their tag, or a counselor moves the wrong one, or a tag falls off a nail and somebody hangs it back on the wrong side. Every waterfront director in the world has cleared a lake for a tag that turned out to be sitting in a boy's pocket. So, we did the thing. Whistle, everyone out, count heads on the beach. 90 children present and accounted for because 2 cabins were at archery. And on the board, on the outside, hanging there, wet, was tag number 91. There was no tag 91. There had never been a tag 91. The set was 1 through 90, and there were exactly 90 nails, and every one of them was full. Except now there were 91. I picked it up. It was birch, aged the same as the others, the same slight cupping from decades of getting wet and drying out. The number was burned in with the same iron in the same hand. It was, in every respect I could test, one of ours. And it was wet. And every other tag on that board was dry. I want to describe what I did because it is what any of us would do, and it is worthless. I took it to the camp director, a man in his 60s called Marsh Olin, and he turned it over twice and said, "Huh, must be an old one from when we ran bigger." And he was probably right. Camps do run bigger, and numbers get retired, and a tag could sit in a drawer for 30 years. I said it was on the outside, and he said then somebody hung it there. That is a completely sufficient explanation, and I accepted it and I went back to work. It came back on the 9th day. Not the same tag. I had put tag 91 in the desk drawer in the dock house under the first aid log, and I checked, and it was still there, and there was a tag 91 hanging on the outside of the board, wet, at the 4 o'clock check. 2 tags. Same wood, same burn, same number. I did not tell Marsh that time. Over the rest of that summer, I collected 11 of them. I want to lay out the pattern because I kept a log, and the log is the only reason I know I was not constructing this. They only ever appeared during a session with a full roster. Weeks where we were under capacity, nothing. There were 2 of those, and both were clean. They only ever appeared on the outside, never in. Not once. They were always wet, and they always appeared at a check where the pair count and the tag count matched. That's the one that took me until August to notice, and that is the one that changed the whole shape of it for me. I had been assuming that a 91st tag meant a phantom swimmer, an extra body in the water. But the numbers always came out right. 45 pairs, 90 children, and then a 91st tag hanging on the outboard, meaning one more person in the water than there were people in the water, and yet the count was clean, which meant it was not adding a swimmer. It was announcing one that was already included. I sat with that on the dock at 10 o'clock at night in the second week of July with the logbook open on my knees, and I understood it, and I have never been able to unthink it since. Somewhere in that count of 90 children raising joined hands in the water, there had been 91 all along, and the board was simply being honest about it. In the 3rd session, I started counting heads myself, physically, walking the beach at every check and touching the top of every wet head, which is not a thing you can do without children finding it hilarious, and I let them find it hilarious because it gave me a reason. I never got 91. Not once. All summer. I counted, personally, at something over 200 checks, and every single time the number was 90. And on 11 of those occasions, there was a wet tag on the board that said otherwise. The staff knew. That's the part one have never worked out how to feel about. There were 4 of us on the waterfront. 2 lifeguards, a small craft instructor, and me. And in the last week of July, on a night off, sitting on the tailgate of a truck in the gravel lot with beers, my senior lifeguard, a woman called Toby Grange, who was 22 and better at that job than I was, said, "So are we going to talk about the extra tag, or are we going to keep doing this?" I said, "You've seen them." And she said, "Farron, I've been hanging them back up." She had 6 of them. She had found them on the outboard at checks when I wasn't on the beach, and she had quietly moved them to the inside and said nothing, because she was 22 and did not want to be the person who reported a ghost to a man in his 60s who signed her paycheck. I asked her why she thought they went on the outside, and she said something that I have repeated to about 4 people in 19 years, and that has never once landed on anybody the way it landed on me. She said, "Because whoever it is knows the rules." Think about that. Every tag correctly hung on the correct side, indicating correctly that its owner was in the water. Not one of those tags was ever in the wrong place. Whatever was putting them there was following a safety protocol invented by a summer camp in the 1950s, precisely every single time for a whole season. It was signing in. We went to the archive in the second week of August. Ondaska had one sort of a room off the back of the office with 60 years of ledgers and photographs and mimeographed newsletters in bankers' boxes, and Toby and I spent 2 evenings in there with a flashlight because the overhead was out. We were looking for a drowning. Of course we were. We did not find one. I want to be very clear about that because it is the point where this stops being a story people can file. In 61 years of operation, Camp Ondaska had never lost a camper in that lake. Not one. There were 2 broken arms in the 1970s, a serious concussion in 1988, and a counselor who had a seizure in the shallows in 1994 and was fine. There was no drowned child. There was no tragic summer. There was nothing. What we found instead, in a box of paperwork from 1957, was a purchase order. The waterfront tag system was installed in the spring of 1957, and the order was for 100 birch blanks, and a note in the margin in fountain pen said, 91 cut, 9 spare. 91 cut. The camp's capacity in 1957 was 91 campers, not 90. They dropped to 90 in 1961 when they took a cabin out of service for a septic problem and never put it back. So there had been a tag 91. There had been a real one in a real set used by real children for 4 summers, and then a cabin was closed and a number was retired and a piece of birch went into a drawer. I put that together sitting on the floor of an archive room in August with a flashlight, and I said out loud, so it's just an old tag. And Toby, who was reading the 1957 register, said, "Farron," and she turned it round and showed me. The register listed campers by number. In 1957, camper number 91, all 8 weeks, all 4 sessions, was the same name. Which is impossible, because sessions were 2 weeks and children went home. The name was Alder Vance. We found him in 1958, too. Same number, all 4 sessions, in 1959 and 1960. 4 summers, 32 weeks. 1 boy in a camp where every other child came for a fortnight. There were no photographs of him. There are hundreds of photographs in those boxes, whole camp shots on the dining hall steps, 4 rows deep, taken at the end of every session, and we went through every one from those 4 years with a magnifying glass over 2 nights. We found him in one. The last session of 1960, back row, far left, at the very edge of the frame where the emulsion goes soft. A boy of about 11, dark hair, in a camp shirt, and he is the only person in that photograph who is not looking at the camera. He is looking to his left, off the edge of the picture, downhill, toward the lake. Marsh Olin retired in 2009, and I went to see him in 2014. in a small house outside Marne Crossing with a view of nothing in particular. And I asked him. He was 81 and entirely sharp, and he made me a coffee, and he sat down and he said, "You found the tag." I said, "I found 11. And he said, "11's a lot. I never had more than 3 or 4 in a season. 40 years. He had been at Ondaska since 1968 in one role or another, and he had known about it for 40 years. And I had worked for him for 6 summers, and he had let me find it myself. And I asked him why, and he said, "Because if I'd told you, you'd have looked for it. And if you look for it, you find it everywhere. And then you can't run a waterfront." Then he told me the rest. And it took about 10 minutes, and it is not very much. Alder Vance was the son of the camp cook in the 50s. He lived on site all summer, every summer, because his mother worked there and there was nowhere else for him to be. And they gave him a number and a tag and let him swim with the sessions because it was 1957. And that is what you did. In September 1960, the season ended, and the family left for the winter, as they did every year. And the boy died in the November, in town, of something respiratory that would be a course of tablets now. He was 11. He was not at the camp. He did not drown. He died in a bed in a house 9 miles away in the off-season of an ordinary illness. And the connection to that lake is nothing except that it is the only place he had ever been happy, which is a sentence Marsh said to me in his kitchen, and which I have not been able to put down since. His mother came back the following summer. She cooked at Ondaska until 1974. And Marsh said, the way I've always had it, from the ones before me, is that she kept hanging his tag. Every check, every session. For 14 years, a woman in a kitchen up the hill would come down to the waterfront at some point in the day and move a piece of birch from one nail to another, and no one ever stopped her. Because, what would you say? And then she retired, and then she died, and somebody threw the tag away, and the board went to 90. I do not have an ending for this. I want to be honest about that. There is no confrontation and no exorcism and no final terrible summer. What happened is that I did my 6th season, and I did it well, and nobody was ever hurt. And I resigned in September for reasons I gave as career-related, and that were not. The camp is still open. It has a website now with a booking system. The waterfront photographs on it show a plastic board with laminated cards because everything gets modernized eventually. And I have looked at those photographs more times than I would like to admit. And I have counted the cards, and there are 120 of them, and they are all numbered. And I do not know what that means, if anything. Here is what I actually think about. On nights when the heating clicks and I am not asleep. 11 times in one summer, something followed the rules. It came down to a board on a wall, and it moved a piece of wood from in to out. And then, at some point in the following 20 minutes, it went into the water with 90 other children, and it raised its hand with a buddy when the whistle went, and it was counted, and the count came out right, which means somebody held its hand. That is the thing. That is the entire thing, and I have never been able to say it out loud to anyone at Ondaska, and I am saying it now. Every one of those 11 checks came out even. 45 pairs, nobody was ever a spare. In a group of 90 children with one extra among them, somebody 11 times on 11 different afternoons in one summer treaded water in a cold lake and put their hand up, joined with a hand that did not belong to any child on my roster. and not one of them ever said anything. I have thought about that for 19 years. Children notice everything. Children report everything constantly in enormous detail, and they would absolutely have told me if a stranger had taken their hand in the water. Unless he wasn't a stranger. Unless he was, to them, simply another kid in the water, and they liked him, and he was fun, and he knew the lake better than anybody, and he was there all session, every session, the way he had been for 4 summers a long time ago. The tags always went to out and never came back to in. Toby hung 6 of them back. I hung the other 5 at the end of the day when the beach was closed. We were signing him out. That's what we were doing for a whole summer without ever once discussing it in those terms. And I have wondered for 19 years what would have happened if we hadn't, if we had simply left them out all night, out all week, out at the end of session on the Friday when the buses came up the gravel road and 90 children went home. I think about a board on a dockhouse wall in the dark with one tag on the outside, and a lake with no measurable bottom, and a boy who has been in the water since 1960 waiting for somebody to come and count him. I never left one out. Not once. I want that on the record. Every night, last thing, before I locked the dockhouse, I moved him back in. I hope somebody still does. I served 412 meals that first Tuesday, and 413 were eaten. I know how that sounds. I have said this sentence out loud perhaps 5 times in 11 years, and I have watched 5 people's faces do the same thing, which is a sort of polite settling, the way a face settles when it has decided you are exaggerating for effect. So, let me be boring about it for a moment, because boring is where this lives. I ran the kitchen at Camp Threnody Ridge for 4 seasons. Not the cook, the manager. I did the ordering, the costing, the staffing, the health inspection paperwork, and the counts. My whole job was counts. How many in, how many out, how much waste, how much left. A camp kitchen runs on a margin of about 4%, and if you cannot count, you cannot do it. My name is Halloran. I was 36 when I took the job, coming out of 11 years of hotel food and a divorce, and I wanted a season somewhere with trees. Threnody Ridge was in the mountains. Real ones, not hills. The camp sat at 4,500 feet in a bowl below a ridge that shaded us from about 4 in the afternoon in June and about 2 in the afternoon in August, so that the last part of every day was cool and blue, and the light went strange. Ponderosa and Lodgepole, a creek that ran hard in June and was gravel by the end of July, and dry, thin, brilliant air that gave every new counselor a headache for 3 days. The dining hall seated 300 at long tables. It had been built in 1948 by a Presbyterian foundation, and had a beamed ceiling like an upturned boat, and when 300 children were in it, the noise was physically painful, and when it was empty, you could hear the creek. We ran 200 campers and about 40 staff, 3 meals a day, plus a 4th for the kitchen crew after service. My numbers were tight because they had to be, and in my first week, I could not make them work. Here is the method, so you can judge it. I plated to account, not a buffet that came later in the season for lunch, but at that time it was tray service, and every tray was assembled and every tray was counted onto a rack, and the racks went out, and the empty trays came back and were counted into the dish pit. Out 412, back 413. The extra tray was not a stray from an earlier meal. We color-coded by service, which is a hotel habit I brought with me and which nobody at that camp had ever bothered with, and which is the only reason I caught any of this. It was, in every way I could establish, a tray that had gone out with that service, been eaten from, and come back. I put it down to a miscount, obviously. On the Wednesday, I counted twice, myself, both ends. 398 out, 399 back. I did that every service for 9 days. 27 services, 27 times. One more tray came back than went out. Never two, never a different number. One. And here is the part that made me stop sleeping properly. The extra tray was always eaten off in the same pattern. Everything gone except the vegetable. Every single time. Whatever the green thing was that day, and camp kitchens serve a lot of green things nobody wants, it was there, untouched, pushed to one side of the compartment, and everything else was clean. I want you to sit with how domestic that is. Not a smear of blood, not a handprint, a child's plate with the peas left. I did what you do. I asked. I asked my cook, a woman called Sabra Oyelaran, who had been at Threnody Ridge for 9 seasons and who was one of the best people I have ever worked with. And she said, "Oh, you're counting the trays." I said, "You know about this." And she said, "Honey, everybody who counts finds it. That's why nobody counts." She said it perfectly lightly, with her hands in a sink, and then she said, "Don't make a thing of it," and it isn't a thing. That was the whole conversation, and I have thought about it for 11 years, and I have come to believe it was the best advice anyone at that camp ever gave me, and that I was constitutionally incapable of taking it, because I count. That's my entire professional identity. So I counted. By the middle of July, I had a spreadsheet kept on a laptop in a cabin with no internet, and it had 4 columns and about 300 rows. And in the whole of that season, there were only 11 services with no extra tray. Those 11 were the interesting ones. Every single one of them was a service where the whole camp ate outside. Cookouts. Twice a week in high season, we did them at a site down by the creek, and on those nights there were no trays at all, so of course there was no extra tray. That's not a data point, that's an absence. Except that on cookout nights, my portion counts were also wrong. I built cookouts by portion. 241 burgers, say. And Sabra and I would come back and I would count the surplus and reconcile it, and on cookout nights the surplus was always exactly 1 portion short. So it was not about the dining hall. It was not about the trays. Whatever this was, it ate wherever we were. In the 3rd week of July, I did the thing that I think about most. And I did it late at night, alone, in a dining hall with the lights off, and I have never fully forgiven myself for it. I set a place, 1 tray at the end of the far table by the north window with the standard supper, everything on it. And I sat in the kitchen doorway in the dark for about 40 minutes with a coffee, and at some point I fell asleep in the chair, which is not the dramatic thing to admit, but it is what happened. And I woke at about 1:30 because the creek noise had changed, which it does when the wind shifts. The tray was eaten, everything gone except the vegetable, which that night was green beans, pushed to one side of the compartment. There was no one in that building. I want to be careful and honest. There were 200 children on that property, and any one of them could have snuck out and eaten a free supper. And if you offered me $100 to bet on the explanation, I would bet on a hungry 11-year-old. But there was flour on the floor. Not from me. I had not laid a trap. I had simply, at the end of the evening, done the thing every kitchen does, which is dust the pastry bench, and the floor between the bench and that far table had a light scatter of it, the way it always did before the morning mop. And there was nothing in it. No footprints, no smears, not one mark, all the way from the kitchen door to that table and back, in a fine dusting of flour that took a print from my own shoe when I walked across it to look. I mopped it myself at 2 in the morning and did not tell Sabra. Now I have to tell you about the photograph, and then I am nearly done because this is not a long story. It is just one that has taken 11 years to sit still. Threnody Ridge did an all-camp photograph on the last day of every session. Everybody on the dining hall steps and the hillside, staff at the sides, 4 or 5 rows deep, taken by whoever had the good camera that year. At the end of my second season, in the office, going through the prints for the newsletter, I did what everybody does with a group photograph, which is look for myself. I found myself, far right, in an apron, squinting, and I counted, because that is my disease, and I counted 238 people. Our roster that session was 237. I did it 4 more times, 238, every time. I have that print. I have had it for 11 years, and I have gone over it with a loop, and I want to tell you what I have found, and it is nothing. There is no extra face. That is the thing. I have identified by name every single person in that photograph. Every camper, every counselor, every kitchen staff, the maintenance man, the nurse, the director. 237 people named in a photograph, and when I count the shapes, I get 238. I have shown it to 11 people. 6 of them get 237. 5 of them get 238, and none of the 5 can point to who the extra one is. That's it. That's the whole of the evidence. I did 2 more seasons after that. 4 in total. And by the 4th one, I had stopped counting. I want to be honest about how that happened, because it was not a decision. It was an accumulation. Somewhere in the 3rd summer, I began, without ever articulating it, to build the extra in. I ordered for 413. I portioned 242 burgers. I put an extra tray on the rack, and it went out, and it came back, and my numbers reconciled perfectly for 2 straight seasons, and my food cost was the best that camp had ever run, and I got a letter of commendation from the foundation board. Sabra caught me doing it in the July of my 3rd year. She came round the pass and looked at the rack and looked at me, and she said, "There you go. That was all. There you go." And I said, "Is this what everybody does?" And she said, "Everybody who lasts." I left after the 4th season for reasons that were entirely ordinary. A better job in a city. A woman I later married. The camp is still there. Sabra retired in 2019, and I went to the party, and it was a good night. Here's the last of it. In my final week, I asked her the question I had been carrying for 4 years. We were sitting on the back step of the kitchen at 11 at night with the ridge black against a sky you cannot see in a city, and I said, "Sabra, what do you think it is?" And she said, "I think it's a kid who's hungry." I said, "And that's all?" And she said, "Halloran, I've fed maybe 40,000 children in this building. Some of them come here because their parents are in trouble. Some of them come on a bursary and they gain 4 pounds in a fortnight, and their counselor writes it in the report like it's a win. And it is a win, and it's also the saddest thing I've ever read over and over for 9 years." She said, "Whatever's coming to my table at night and eating everything but the greens, I know exactly what that is, because I have served it a hot meal every summer of my working life." Then she said, "And it leaves the vegetables. So how frightened do you want me to be?" I laughed. I remember laughing. And then she said the thing that ended the conversation and that I have never got out from under. She said, "Only When I started here, it was 2. I said, "What?" And she said, 2 extra trays. Every service, 9 years ago, when I came, it went to 1 in my 4th season. I asked what that meant, and Sabra Oyelaran, who is the most sensible person I have ever worked alongside, looked out at the dark and said, "Well, either one of them stopped being hungry," she let that sit for a moment, "or one of them finished." I have never been able to decide which of those is worse, and I have had 11 years, and I still order 1 extra of everything when I cook at home for 4 people in a house where there are 3 of us, and my wife thinks it is a professional habit. It is. That's exactly what it is. I just don't tell her whose. Reveille sounded at 7 in the morning on the 14th of January, and there had not been a child on that property since August. I heard it from the caretaker's cabin, half a mile up the hill, through 2 feet of snow and a closed window, and I lay in a cold bed at 58 years old and listened to a bugle call I had heard every summer morning for 31 years, and I thought, well, there it is. I was not frightened. I want to establish my position at the start, because it is unusual, and it colors everything. My name is Otho Wren. I was the maintenance man at Camp Kelder Brook for 31 summers, and the winter caretaker for 22 of them, and I knew that place the way you know a body you have washed. Every pipe, every joist, every one of the 11 cabins, which I had re-roofed twice, and the dining hall, which I had fought a losing war with since 1994. Kelder Brook was in the north, on a plateau, in a country of low hills and black spruce and bog. In summer it was pleasant. In winter it was another planet. The road in was 9 miles of unplowed track, and I kept it open to the highway with a blade on the front of an old tractor. And some years I did not manage it, and I was in there for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, which is a thing people find alarming and which I always found to be the best part of the year. Winter caretaking is a real job, and it is mostly about water and weight. Water, because a pipe that freezes in November costs the foundation $11,000 in April. Weight, because snow on a flattish roof will find the weakest truss in a building put up in 1952, and it will find it at 3 in the morning. So I walked the camp every day, every single day, all winter, for 22 years, a circuit of about 2.5 miles that took me 1 hour and 10 in good conditions and 3 hours in bad. And I did it in the dark at both ends of the day because the daylight up there in January is a rumor. I knew that place empty better than anyone has ever known it full. The bugle was not the first thing. It was the 4th or 5th, but it was the first one I could not put down. Let me go in order. The first winter it happened was 2011, my 19th as caretaker. In the November, I found a door open. Cabin 6, the second door, the one at the far end that we kept bolted top and bottom from the inside because the frame had dropped. You cannot open that door from outside. There is no handle on the outside. I had taken the handle off myself in 2003. It was standing open about a foot, with snow blown into the doorway, and both bolts were drawn back. I closed it and I bolted it, and I made a note in the log, because I kept a log, in the same hardback ledgers the camp had used since the 50s, and I have all 22 of them in a box in my daughter's garage. In December, I found it again, same door. In January, I stopped bolting it as an experiment, and it stayed shut all month, and the moment I bolted it again in February, it was open within 4 days. That is the sort of thing a man can live with. Buildings settle. Frost heave moves a foundation an inch, and a bolt that was tight in October is not tight in January. I wrote that in the log, and I believed it, and I still half believe it. The second thing was the paths. Snow tells you everything. That is the great gift and the great curse of a northern winter. You cannot move on a property in fresh snow without writing it down. And in the January of that first year, I began to find, after a fall, that my circuit had been walked before me. Not footprints. That is what everybody assumes, and it is not what I am describing. There were no prints. What there was compaction. A path across a snowfield that has been walked and then snowed on again shows up as a slight depression, a firmness underfoot, a line you can feel through your boots before you can see it. It is how you find last week's route. And on a morning after 11 inches of fresh snow, with no tracks anywhere on that property, I walked my own circuit and felt the whole way round that I was walking in a groove every day. From January the 9th onward, that year and every winter after. I tested it in 2013. I changed the route, I walked the circuit backward, and then I walked a completely different loop that took in the chapel and the boathouse in the wrong order, and I did that for 9 days. And on the 10th day, the groove was in the new route. Whatever it was following me, not preceding me, learning. The third thing was the lights. And I am going to be quick about the lights because they are the least interesting and the most easily explained. The main breaker at Kelder Brook was in a shed by the dining hall, and I threw it in October, and it stayed off till May. And 11 times over the years, I came round a corner at dusk and saw a light in the dining hall windows. And 11 times I went and checked the breaker and it was off. And 11 times, by the time I got back, the light was too. Old glass and a low sun does that. I have seen it happen with my own reflection and a headlamp. I am not going to pretend that one is evidence. The fourth thing was the Bugle. Kelder Brook did reveille on a real bugle for its whole history, played live by a staff member on the dining hall steps at 7 in the morning, and when nobody on staff could play it, they used a recording through the PA, which they did from about 1998 onward. There was a mounted horn speaker on the dining hall gable, and a CD player in the office, and a timer. By 2011, that system had been dead for 6 years. I had disconnected the speaker myself when we redid the gable end in 2009. The wire was cut, and the CD player was in a box in the office with a dead battery in its clock. The power was off at the main, and on the 14th of January, 2014, at 7 in the morning, reveille sounded across that camp at full volume from the direction of the dining hall. I got dressed and I went down. It took me 40 minutes in the snow. The speaker was where I had left it, disconnected, with the wire hanging out of the gable, and the office was locked and the CD player was in its box and the main breaker was off, and I stood in the snow in the blue half-light and I said out loud, "All right." That's all I said. All right. Because here is my position, and it took 22 winters to arrive at, and I will not be talked out of it. That camp was lonely. I do not mean that I was lonely. I was fine. I mean the place. Kelder Brook was built to hold 240 children, and for 10 months of every year it held nobody. And it had been doing that since 1952. And I have come to think that a building learns what it is for the way a hand learns a tool. 9 weeks of noise and 43 weeks of nothing, over and over, for 60 years. Of course it walked the paths. Of course it opened cabin 6. Of course, on a morning in the middle of January, in the dead cold, with the light not up, something in that place did the one thing it knew how to do, which was to sound the call that starts the day. Nobody came, obviously. That's the part that would break your heart if you let it. I heard Reval 4 more times over the following 8 winters. Always in January, always the 14th or 15th, which is as close as I can date it, and always at 7 exactly. In 2019, I did something I have never told my daughter about. I went down the night before, and I slept in the dining hall. Sleeping bag, camp stove, a lantern. 59 years old on the floor of a building at 14 below because I had decided I wanted to be in the room. And at 7 in the morning on the 15th of January, nothing happened at all. I lay there until 8:30 in the gray light with the lantern out, and the building ticked and settled the way they do, and there was nothing. And I got up and packed my bag, and I felt, and I mean this exactly, embarrassed for it. The way you feel when a shy dog will not come out from under a chair while you are watching. I walked back up to my cabin, and at 11 minutes past 9, from half a mile away, Reveille sounded, 2 hours late. Which is a thing that has never happened in the entire history of that camp, and which I have decided, in my own private accounting, means that it waited until I was in the right place. Not until I was gone. Until I was home. Until I was in the caretaker's cabin, where the caretaker is supposed to be at the start of the day, so that the call would find me where it was meant to find me. I retired in 2021. 61 years old, 2 bad knees and a shoulder that had never been right since a roof in 1998. The camp closed the following year. Not because of anything. Enrollment, insurance, the price of everything. The foundation sold the property to a family from the city who I am told are going to build a house on the point. I went out there one last time in the November before the sale with permission to walk the circuit. It was a still day, hard frost, no snow yet, and everything was that color that a northern landscape goes in late autumn, which is not brown and not gray and does not have a name. I did the whole 2.5 miles, cabins 1 to 11, the chapel, the boathouse, the dining hall, where I stood for a while. And at the end of it, at the flagpole in the middle of the field, I did a thing that I had planned in the truck on the drive up and that I still could not tell you the reason for. I called the roll. Not names. I did not have names. What I did was stand at that flagpole in the cold with my hat off and count out loud from 1 to 11, the cabins, the way we did on the first morning of every session for 31 years, and after each number, I said, present. Cabin 1, present. Cabin 2, all the way to 11. And then I said, camp's complete, and I put my hat on, and I walked back to the truck. It took about 90 seconds. I felt like a lunatic for about 11 of them, and then I did not feel like a lunatic at all. Here's the ending, and it isn't frightening, and I have made my peace with the fact that most people find that disappointing. I did not hear anything. There was no bugle, no light, no groove in a path. It was a still, cold Tuesday in November, and I was an old man alone in a field. But I have thought a great deal in the 4 years since about what I actually did out there. For 60 years, that place woke up every morning of the summer and was told in one form or another that everyone was accounted for. And then in August, the buses went down the road and it was told nothing at all for 43 weeks, and then it was told nothing at all again for another 43, and then the buses stopped coming entirely, and it was never told anything again. I do not think Kelder Brook was haunted. I have never once used that word about it, and I am not going to start now. I think it was a place that had been given a job and did it well for 60 years and then had the job taken away and kept going in the dark, in the snow, walking the paths and sounding the call. Somebody should have told it. That's all I did. I told it. And if there is anything left out there now, under a new house on the point with a family in it who have never heard of a bugle, then I would like to believe that on some morning in January it will not sound the call, because it does not need to anymore, because a man who knew every joist in the place stood at the flagpole in the cold and said the only thing it had been waiting 60 years to hear. Camp's complete. Go on and rest. The photograph had 11 cabins in the background, and I only ever slept in 10. I noticed it at 43 years old, in a hotel function room, holding a glass of warm white wine, at a reunion I had not wanted to attend. My name is Ren Kessick. I was a camper at Bell Hollow Girls Camp for 6 summers in the 1990s, from 9 to 14, and then a counselor in training at 15, and then I never went back, and neither did anybody else, because the camp closed in 1999 for reasons that were on the front page of a regional paper for about 4 days and then were not. The reunion was in 2019, 20 years on. Someone had made a Facebook group, and it had grown to 900 people. And then, the way these things do, it had produced an actual event in an actual hotel outside the actual town, and about 140 women in their 30s and 40s had come. I went because my sister made me. She was at Bell Hollow, too, 4 years behind me, and she has a much simpler relationship with it than I do. The photograph was on a board by the door. Someone had blown up about 40 archive prints to a 3 and pinned them up, and people stood in front of them making the noises that women in their 40s make in front of pictures of themselves at 12. This one was from 1996. Whole camp on the meadow, taken from the hill, in the late afternoon with the cabin line behind us. And there were 11 cabins. Bell Hollow had 10. I would have said that in a court of law. 10 cabins, named after birds, in a line along the north edge of the meadow, and I slept in 5 of them across 6 summers and could still, at 43, have told you the order: kingfisher, merlin, sparrowhawk, corncrake, nightjar, redstart, fieldfare, bittern, curlew, wryneck. 10. I could sing it. We had a clapping game with it. In the photograph, there were 11 buildings in that line. I stood there for a long time. Then I found my sister and pulled her over and said, "How many cabins were there?" And she said, 10. And then she looked at the photograph and stopped talking. We got a third opinion, a woman called Poppy Anstrether, who had been in my cabin in 1995 and who was now something senior in local government, and she counted and said 11, and then she said, "That's the sick hut." And my sister said we didn't have a sick hut. Nurse was in the lodge. And Poppy said, "No, the old one, down the end past Wryneck." I said, "Poppy, there's nothing past Wryneck. There's the tree line." And she said, "No, there's..." And then she stopped in exactly the way my sister had stopped, in exactly the way I imagine I had stopped, which is mid-sentence with your mouth still open around a fact that has just stepped backward out of your reach. Here is what the 3 of us established over the following 2 hours, standing in a hotel function room while a disco we had all forgotten about started up in the next space along. All three of us could see 11 buildings in the photograph. All three of us, asked cold, said the camp had 10 cabins. All three of us could name the 10. And all three of us, when we tried to look directly at the 11th building in our memories, found a kind of soft place, not a blank. Poppy described it best. She said, "It's like the word for a thing you've only ever read and never heard said. You know it's there. You can't get at it." We asked 11 more women that night, casually, one at a time, the way you can at a party. 9 of them said 10 cabins. 2 of them said 11, without hesitating, and one of those 2, a woman called Delphine Hobbs, who had been a counselor in 1997 and 1998, said it with a look on her face that made me go and get her a drink and sit her down in the corner. She said, "You're the first person who's ever asked me." She had been 20 in 1998. She said there was a building at the end of the line, past Rhineck, that was not on the site plan and was not in the fire drill and was not allocated to a cabin group, and that had a padlock on the outside, and that she had asked about once in her first summer and had been told by the camp director, a woman called Mrs. Availing, that it was storage. Delphine said, and it was storage. I looked in it. There were tents in it. I asked what was wrong with that, and she said, nothing. There were tents in it. That is completely true, and I saw them with my own eyes, and I have never once been able to make myself believe it. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of the whole evening. She said, "Do you remember the 12 o'clock walk?" And Poppy Anstruther, who had been listening, put her glass down on a table and said, "Oh my God, I did not remember it. Not at first. It came back over the following 4 or 5 minutes in pieces, in the way that a smell brings something back, and I want to describe it as carefully as I can, because the reconstruction of that memory is the single strangest experience of my adult life. At Bell Hollow, at midnight, somebody walked the cabin line. Every night, all summer, every one of the 6 summers I was there. You would be lying in a bunk in the dark in a wooden building with 9 other girls and the sound of the meadow outside, and at some point you would hear feet on the boardwalk, unhurried, going from the Kingfisher end to the Rhineck end. Boots on boards. 11 or 12 steps between each cabin, and they would pause at each door. Not knock. Pause. 3 or 4 seconds of nothing. Right outside, and then move on. We all knew about it. It was completely normalized. It was night walk, capital letters, and it was, as far as any child at that camp understood, a member of staff checking that everyone was in bed. Except Delphine, who was staff, said, "We never did that. There was no night round at Bell Hollow. Staff went to bed at 11, and the director had a whistle by her bed, and that was the entire overnight provision. And I know that because I raised it at training in 1998 as a safeguarding issue, and I was told there was no budget." She said, "I heard those feet every night for 2 summers, and I assumed it was another counselor, and I never once asked. And I have thought about that for 21 years. We put it to the room. Not formally, but by about 10:30 that evening, the reunion had quietly turned into something else, and there were maybe 30 women standing around in a loose group with drinks, in their 40s, in a hotel, comparing a sound. Everybody remembered it. Every single person in that room who had been a camper at Bell Hollow between 1991 and 1999 remembered footsteps on the boardwalk at midnight, pausing at each door, and every single one of them had assumed for their entire adult life that it was a member of staff, and not one of them had ever mentioned it to another human being. Because why would you mention the most ordinary thing in the world? That's the thing that keeps me up. Not the footsteps. 300 children a summer for 9 years. And the reason nobody ever said anything is that it was too boring to say. Now, the last part, and it is the part one, have the least of. Bell Hollow closed in the autumn of 1999 following an inspection. The paper said financial irregularities and buildings not meeting standard. There was no scandal of the kind you are expecting. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was charged. Mrs. Eveling, who was 61, retired to her sisters and died in 2004. The site was sold and the buildings came down in 2002, and there is a solar farm on the meadow now. I have driven past it twice. In the January after the reunion, Poppy, who had access to things because of her job, found the plans. She sent me a photograph taken on her phone in a records office of the 1962 site plan for Bell Hollow Girls Camp. 10 cabins in a line named after birds. And at the end of the line, past Rhineck, a small rectangle marked with a word. Not storage, not sick hut. It said, retained. That's all. One word in a draughtsman's hand on a building that predated the camp, because the camp was built in 1962 on the site of something else. And the something else was a wartime facility of a type that the county records describe in 9 words and no more. And Poppy has looked, and I have looked, and there is nothing else. The building was there before the camp. The camp was built around it. It was kept, and it was marked retained. And for 37 years, 300 girls a summer slept in a line of 10 buildings with an 11th at the end of the row that had tents in it and a padlock on the outside. And every night at midnight, something walked the boards from one end to the other and stopped at every door and listened. Delphine said the last useful thing anybody has said about it. We were outside the hotel at 1 a.m, both of us cold, and she said, "You know what I've never been able to get past?" I said, "What?" And she said, "It always started at Kingfisher." I said, "So?" And she said Kingfisher was the 9-year-olds, Rhineck was the 15s. It walked from the youngest to the oldest, every single night, in order. And then it stopped. She said, "That's not a patrol." And I said, "What is it?" And Delphine Hobbs, who is 51 now, and a pediatric physiotherapist and the least fanciful person I have ever met, said, "It's the same thing I do on a ward at night." She said, "You start at the littlest and you work up, and you don't wake them. You just stand there for 3 seconds and you listen to them breathe. And if they're breathing, you move on." Then she got into a taxi. I have not slept well since 2019, and I want to be precise about why, because it is not fear. Every night for 6 summers of my childhood, something came and stood outside my door in the dark and listened to me breathe, and then went on to the next one. And it did that all the way down the line, from the 9-year-olds to the 15s, 300 children a night, all summer, for 37 years, and it never came in, and nothing ever happened to any of us. And in 2002, they knocked the building down. That's what I lie there thinking about. Not the walking. The stopping. Somewhere out there, under a solar farm on a meadow in the north, there is a piece of ground where something stood for 37 years doing rounds nobody asked it to do, on a line of 10 cabins that got emptied out one summer and never filled again. And I was in Curlew in 1996, 9 steps from the end, second to last door. Every night, whatever it was, after it had listened to me, took 11 more steps to Rhineck and stood there and listened to the 15-year-olds and then had nowhere else to go. I wonder what it did then, standing at the end of a boardwalk at 10 past midnight with the whole line checked and everyone breathing. I hope it went back to the beginning. I really do. I hope it went round again. The 11th child came into my infirmary with a burn on the inside of her left wrist, and I knew whose name would be next before she told me. That is not a thing a nurse should ever be able to say. I want to open there because everything that came after was me trying and failing to make that sentence untrue. My name is Atavia Renke. I was 51. I had done 26 years in emergency medicine and then 8 in occupational health. And I took a summer at Camp Islewood the year after my husband died because a friend of mine on the board said, "Come and do nothing in a nice place." And I said, all right. Islewood was in the low country, not mountains, not forest exactly. It sat on a peninsula in a system of shallow lakes and marsh, in a landscape of reeds and open water and long horizontal light, where the tallest thing for 2 miles was the water tower. It was flat, and it was wet, and it was, in a way I did not expect, one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. In the evening, the whole camp turned the color of a peach, and the frogs started at 7 and did not stop. There were 211 campers that summer, ages 8 to 16, in a 4-week residential session that ran through July. The infirmary was a single-story block with 4 beds, a treatment room, a small office, and a dispensary that would not have passed inspection in any hospital in the country. I brought it up to standard in 9 days, and then I sat in it and waited to be needed, which is the whole of camp nursing. You get a lot of nothing. Homesickness that presents as stomachache, sunburn, insect bites, a great deal of insect bites in that country. 2 or 3 real things a season. A fracture, an asthma attack, an allergic reaction, and you earn your entire salary in 11 minutes. I kept the log the way I keep every log, because I have given evidence at 2 inquests in my career, and both times the log was the only thing that stood between a colleague and ruin. Date, time, name, age, cabin, presentation, treatment, disposition, longhand in a bound book, numbered pages. The first one came in on the 8th of July. A boy of 9 called Ansel Beek from cabin 2 with a superficial burn on the inside of his left wrist. About 2 centimeters by 1, roughly oval, no blistering, painful but not severe. I asked how he had done it, and he said he did not know. That is completely normal. Children of 9 do not know how they have done anything. I cleaned it, dressed it, gave him a lolly from the drawer, and wrote it up. The second came in the next morning. A girl of 12, Maren Bevis, cabin 7. Superficial burn inside of the left wrist, 2 centimeters by 1, roughly oval. She also did not know how. I want to be honest about my thinking at that point, because it was entirely correct and entirely wrong. 2 children with matching burns in 24 hours is a safeguarding flag. That is not a ghost story. That is a mandatory report. My immediate hypothesis was that something on that property was hot and that children were touching it, or, less pleasantly, that children were doing it to each other, because they do, and it comes in waves, and it usually involves a lighter and a dare. So I did the work. I walked the camp with the maintenance man, and we found 4 things that could burn a child, and I had 3 of them fixed, and the 4th cordoned off within a day. I spoke to both cabin counselors. I put a quiet word round the staff meeting. And on the 10th of July, a boy of 14 called Carl Branna came in with a superficial burn on the inside of his left wrist. 2 centimeters by 1, roughly oval, cause unknown. I looked at the 3 entries in my log that evening, and I did not see it. I want that recorded. It took me 11 days and 11 children before I saw it, and I am a person who is paid to notice patterns. Ansel Beek, Marin Bevis, Carl Branna. The camp roster was alphabetical by surname. Beek, Bevis, Branna. In order, 1 a day. I checked the roster on the 18th of July, sitting in my office with the log open and the printed list beside it, and I went down the page with my finger, and every single presentation of that burn, 11 of them in 11 consecutive days, was the next name on the list. Not the next name after the previous burn. The next name, full stop. It had not skipped anybody. Between Beek and Bevis on the roster, there were no other children. Between Branna and Caro, there were none. It was working through the alphabet without missing a single child, at a rate of exactly 1 per day, starting on the 8th of July. 211 names. I did the arithmetic at my desk with a pen and I got a date. And the date was the 4th of February the following year, which was 3 months after the camp closed for the season. And I sat there for a while feeling like I had made a category error somewhere in my life. Now, I want to walk through everything I did in order because I did everything and I want to be judged on it. I reported it that same night to the director, a woman called Bess Euler, who was competent and unimaginative in the best way, and who took me completely seriously and who called the board the next morning. We had an environmental health officer on site within 48 hours. He was thorough. He tested the water, the play equipment, the kitchen, the dorm heating, everything metal in direct sun. He found nothing that would produce that burn, and he said, off the record at his car, that in his opinion I was looking at contact dermatitis from a shared object, a rope, a bat handle, something with a chemical on it, and that the alphabetical thing was a coincidence of a small sample. 11 is a small sample. He was right to say that. On the 19th of July, Prosper Caro, cabin 4, came in with a burn on the inside of his left wrist. I photographed everything from then on. I had a camp camera and I took a scaled photograph of every single one, and I have them still on a drive in a box, and I have looked at them perhaps 4 times in 11 years. They are identical, not similar. I have overlaid them. The shape is the same shape to within a millimeter. 2 centimeters by 1, roughly oval, with a slight point at the ulnar end. By the 24th of July, I had 18 children and 18 photographs and a roster with 18 consecutive names crossed off in pencil. And here is the part that I have never satisfactorily explained to anybody, including 2 doctors and 1 very patient friend who is a psychologist. The children were not frightened. Every one of them came in of their own accord at some point in the morning, unaccompanied, and showed me their wrist, and none of them could say how it had happened, and none of them were distressed. They were mildly interested. Several of them thought it was funny. One girl of 15, Tamsin Chell, said, "Oh, I got the thing," like she was reporting a mosquito bite. I asked her what she meant by the thing, and she said, "Everyone's getting it. It's going round." I said, "Does it hurt?" And she said, "It did in the night." That was the first anyone told me it happened in the night. And I had not asked, because I had not thought to, because I had been so busy with the daytime hypothesis that I never asked the one question that mattered. From then on, I asked all of them, every child, same question. When did you first notice it? And every single one of them said a version of the same thing, which was, I woke up and it was there. None of them woke because of it. That is the detail. Nobody was woken by pain. They woke at the ordinary time, in the ordinary way, and found a fresh burn on the inside of their left wrist, and by then the pain had already peaked and was going. On the 26th of July, I stayed up. Bess Euler agreed to it, formally, in writing, which I insisted on, and we did it properly. I sat in cabin 9 from 10 at night until 6 in the morning with the counselor, in a chair with a book and a torch, and the child whose name was next on the roster was in the third bunk on the left. Her name was Idani Cullimore. She was 10. Nothing happened. I sat there for 8 hours in a wooden cabin with 11 sleeping children and the frogs going outside and the smell of pond water and insect repellent, and I watched a 10-year-old girl sleep the whole night on her right side with her left arm outside the covers, and at 6:10 she woke up and stretched and said good morning, and there was nothing on her wrist. I want to tell you that I felt relief. What I actually felt, and I am ashamed of it, was a kind of stupid disappointment. At 7:50 she came to the infirmary door with a burn on the inside of her left wrist. It had appeared, she said, when she was brushing her teeth. She had looked down, and it was there. She had not felt it happen. There were 11 other girls in the washroom, and none of them saw anything, and I asked all of them, individually, that afternoon. That was the day I stopped being a nurse about it. We closed the camp on the 28th of July, 4 days early. That was Bess's decision, and it was the right one, and it cost that camp a great deal of money and a fair amount of reputation, and I have never once heard her complain about it. 20 children, 20 photographs, 20 consecutive surnames, Beak through Duddridge, in order, one a day, with no absences and no skips. The parents were told there had been a cluster of unexplained minor injuries and that the camp was acting out of caution. There were complaints. There was a piece in a regional paper. Islewood reopened the following summer with a new nurse and has run every year since, and as far as I know, nothing has ever happened there again. Here is what I found in the November, and then I am finished. Because after this, there is nothing but 11 years of thinking. I could not let it go, and so I went to the county archive, which is what people in these stories always do. And I want to say that it is far less exciting than it sounds, and mostly involves a photocopier that eats your change. The Islewood Peninsula had been a camp since 1958. Before that, from 1912 to 1954, it had been a sanatorium, not for tuberculosis, for children with what the records of the period call nervous conditions, which covered a very great deal of ground, and covered, in that institution, mostly epilepsy. And the treatment they used for 42 years on children between 8 and 16 in a low building on a peninsula in the marsh was a form of counter-irritation. It was standard practice for a long time, and it was abandoned for good reasons. A heated instrument applied to the skin on a schedule. There were photographs in the file, 3 of them, medical documentation, undated, of a child's forearm, inside of the left wrist, 2 centimeters by 1, roughly oval with a slight point at the ulnar end. And there was a ward book. That is the thing I actually came home with in a photocopy, and that is in a box under my stairs. 42 years of a treatment register ruled in columns in 11 different hands as the staff changed over the decades. Name, age, date, applied by. And the names are alphabetical, not by admission. They ran the ward alphabetically, which was normal for the period, and they worked down the list, one child per day, and when they got to the end of the alphabet, they went back to the beginning and started again. 42 years, round and round. I have sat with this for 11 years, and I have arrived at exactly one thought that I consider worth passing on, and it is not about ghosts. Whatever happened at Islewood in that July did not hurt those children. 20 superficial burns, no blistering, no infection, no scarring in any of the 4 I followed up on. It was, medically, close to nothing. If it had happened to one child, I would have dressed it and forgotten it. What it was diligent. Something on that peninsula was working through a list. In order. Once a day, not missing anybody. And when I sat up all night in cabin 9 to catch it, it did not come, and it waited until the morning, and it did the job anyway, and it did the job on the correct child on the correct day. I do not think it was angry. I do not think it was aware of us at all in the way you would need to be aware of someone in order to hate them. I think somewhere in that flat, wet landscape there is 42 years of routine that never got told to stop. And I think about the nurses. That's the part that gets me at 2 in the morning. 11 different hands in that ward book. Over 4 decades. Women my age, in a low building in the marsh, doing something to a child every day that they had been told was medicine, and going home and coming back the next day and doing it to the next name. They were not monsters. That is the whole horror of it. They were nurses, doing the protocol, keeping the log, initialing the column marked applied by in good handwriting for 42 years. I know exactly what that looks like from the inside. I have kept that log. I have initialed that column. And here is the thing I have never said out loud, and I am going to say it now and then I am going to go to bed. On the 26th of July, in cabin 9, at about 4 in the morning, sitting in a chair in the dark with a book I was not reading and a torch I was not using, I caught myself doing something with my hands. My right hand was resting on my left forearm, thumb on the inside of the wrist, 2 centimeters by 1, more or less, at the base of the palm, pressing lightly, in a slow rhythm, the way you would if you were holding something steady. I do not know how long I had been doing it. I put my hands in my lap, and I sat on them until the sun came up. There were 14 of us on that mesa, and something counted us every night, out loud, in the dark, and it always got to 15. I have never been able to decide whether it was miscounting or whether it knew something I did not. My name is Ivar Sandhagen. I was 33, and for 2 years I worked as a field instructor for a wilderness therapy program called Redhorn Passage, which took adolescents with substance problems and violence histories and eating disorders into the high desert for 8 to 10-week expeditions and tried with genuine sincerity and mixed results to give them something they could not get in a building. I want to say at the start that I believe in that work. There are bad programs in that industry, and there have been serious harms, and I know all the arguments. Redhorn was one of the good ones. We were properly staffed, properly trained, medically covered, and nobody in my 2 years was ever coerced or restrained or humiliated. And I got letters afterward from 3 kids, and I have them still. I say that because what follows is going to sound like a place where something bad happened, and I need you to hold both. The country was the Kessel Rim, which is a plateau in the high desert at about 6,000 feet, cut by canyons, with juniper and pinyon in the folds and nothing at all on the tops. red rock and blue sage, and a sky that in the daytime is a color that does not photograph. At night, it was the coldest and clearest place I have ever slept. In October, at that altitude, it would go to 38 in the afternoon and freeze at 4 in the morning, and the temperature swing was so extreme that you could hear the rock talking as it cooled. Actual ticking and cracking all night, in every direction, the sandstone giving up the day. You learn to sleep through that. Everyone does, in about 4 nights. The group I want to tell you about was in the autumn of my second year. 11 students, ages 15 to 17, and 3 staff. Me, a woman called Petra Okonjo, who was the senior instructor and the best field practitioner I have ever worked with, and a young guy called Des Arbuckle, who was 24 and in his first season and who is a large part of why I am telling this. 14 people. That is the number. 11 and 3. The counting started on the 11th night at a camp we called Two Springs, in a shallow bowl on the rim with a stand of junipers on the west side. I was on second watch, which ran from about 1 to 4. Watch at Redhorn was not about danger. There is nothing on the Kessel Rim that will hurt you except the cold and your own decisions. It was about students. Kids in early withdrawal do not sleep, and kids who are frightened walk, and somebody sat up. So I was awake by the fire ring with no fire in it, in a down jacket, at about 2:30, with 14 people in a circle of bivy bags around me, and a sky with the whole of the galaxy in it. And something began to count. It came from the junipers, about 40 meters west. A voice, low, not whispering, at conversational volume, but somehow contained, so that it did not carry the way a voice should on open ground at night. It said, 1. Then a pause of 2 or 3 seconds. 2. Pause. 3. It went to 15 and stopped. Then, after perhaps a minute, it started again. 1, 2, 3. I sat there and I let it go round 4 times before I moved, and I want to explain that because it sounds like paralysis, and it was not. It was assessment. My first, second, and third hypotheses were all a student. A kid awake in the dark doing something odd is the single most likely thing in that environment, and if you go crashing toward a frightened 17-year-old at 2:30 in the morning, you make everything worse. So I counted the bags first. 14. All of them occupied. I could see chests moving in 4 of them from where I sat, and I knew the shapes of the other 10. Then I got up, and I walked toward the junipers with my headlamp off, because your night vision at 6,000 feet with no moon is extraordinary, and a headlamp destroys it in a second. It stopped when I was about 15 meters out, not fled. Stopped, mid-sequence on 7, and did not finish, and there was nothing in those trees. I stood in them for 10 minutes, and then I walked a circle at 30 meters, and then a circle at 60, and there was nothing at all. And the ground there is sand and grit and holds a print beautifully, and there were no prints but mine. I woke Petra at 4 for handover, and I told her, and she listened all the way through without interrupting, which is one of the things I liked most about her. And at the end she said, 15. I said yes. And she said, that's not how many of us there are. I said, I know. And she said, no, Ivor. Listen, 15 is how many there were on the intake list. We had lost a student on day 2. A boy of 16 who had a family situation change and was pulled by his parents entirely routinely, and who had walked out to the road with a staff member on the second morning and gone home and was, as far as anyone knew, absolutely fine. His name was Ellis Tarn. 15 names on the manifest that came out with us to the trailhead. 14 people from the second day onward. I want to be extremely careful about what I am claiming here, because this is where a story like this goes wrong. I am not telling you that the desert was counting a boy who was in Denver with his mother. I am telling you what the number was, and I am telling you that we noticed it, and that noticing it did something to the three of us over the following weeks that I have never fully recovered from. It counted every night for the rest of that expedition. 31 more nights. Not always from the junipers. It followed us. We moved camp every 2 or 3 days, sometimes 11 miles, into canyons and up onto the rim and out to a place called the Long Bench, where you can see 40 miles in 3 directions, and every single night, somewhere between 1 and 4 in the morning, from somewhere between 30 and 100 meters out, something counted to 15 and started again. The students never heard it. That's the fact I cannot get past, and it is the reason none of this ever went into a report. 11 adolescents sleeping outdoors in a circle, several of them chronic insomniacs, several of them hypervigilant in the specific way that kids with certain histories are hypervigilant, and not one of them, in 31 nights, ever mentioned a voice. I tested it. Carefully and ethically, and without ever putting the idea in their heads. I asked open questions at Morning Circle. What did you notice last night? What woke you? Anybody hear anything? Coyotes, rock cracking, Des snoring, someone crying twice, which we dealt with. Never a voice. Only staff heard it. All 3 of us, independently, on our own watches, and we compared notes at handover every single night for a month, and our descriptions matched to a degree that in any other context would be considered strong evidence. Des Arbuckle took it hardest. He was 24, and it was his first season, and he was, I think, more porous than Petra and I were. By the 3rd week, he had stopped sleeping properly and had started sitting up through other people's watches. And Petra pulled him aside and did the conversation you have to do, and he said all the right things, and he did not get better. In the 4th week, he told me what was bothering him, and it was not what I expected. We were sitting on the rim at dusk, with the light going that impossible color, and he said, "Ivor, have you noticed the pauses?" I said, "What about them?" And he said, "They're not even." He had timed them. He had lain in his bag with a watch night after night, and he had timed the intervals between the numbers, and he had found that the counting was not metronomic. It paused longer at some numbers than others. He said, "It's the same every night. It's quick through the first 4, then there's a long one before 5, then quick, then a long one before 11, then quick, then a really long one before 15. I said, "So?" And Des said, "I think it's not counting. I think it's checking." I asked what that meant, and he said, "If you're counting sheep in a pen, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 even. If you're checking a list of names against faces, you go fast when you know them, and you stop when you have to look." Then he said, "It stops longest before 15, because 15 isn't there." I have thought about that conversation for 11 years. Nothing happened. I want to be very clear about the ending of this, because there isn't one in the sense that stories usually mean. We completed the expedition. 32 nights of counting and 11 students who all finished, and 6 of whom did well afterward, which is a good number in that field, and one of whom is now a wilderness instructor herself and does not know any of this. We walked out at the Kessel Trailhead on the 9th of November, and the last night, at a camp 2 miles from the road, it counted to 15 4 times. And then, at about 3:30, it counted to 14 once. just once. It said 14, and it stopped. And then it did not start again. And there was nothing for the rest of that night. And I sat by a dead fire ring until dawn, waiting for a sound that never came. I have never been out on the Kessel Rim since. Redhorn closed in 2016, when the insurance market for that industry collapsed. Petra runs a training organization now, and we speak twice a year, and we have discussed this exactly twice. Desar Bugle left the field after that season and went into software. I called him in 2021 out of nowhere because I had been thinking about the pauses. And we talked for about an hour, and it was good to hear him. And near the end, I asked whether he still thought about it. And he said, every day. Then he said something that I have not been able to put down since, and that is the reason I have finally written this out. He said, Ivor. I looked him up, Ellis Tarn. I said, and? And Des said, he's fine. Married, kids, he's in insurance in Ohio. I found him on LinkedIn, and I looked at his face for about 20 minutes, and then I closed the laptop. I said, well, good. And Des said, yeah, except. And then he said he was pulled on day 2. He went home on day 2. So he was never at Two Springs. He was never on the long bench. He never spent a single night out there. He said, so whatever was counting us wasn't counting who was in the circle. It was counting who was supposed to be. And I said, I know. And he said, no. Listen, that's not the part. The part is, it took 32 nights to notice he wasn't coming. And then he said the thing, and we hung up shortly after, and we have not spoken since. He said, Ivor, how long do you think it's going to take it to notice about us? I have run this camp for 22 years, and I have known for 19 of them, and I have opened the gates every June anyway, and I would like to explain myself while there is still somebody to explain to. My name is Perpetua Ashgar. I am 68 years old. I am the director of Camp Wilderfell. And next Friday, I am going to close it for the last time. And I have decided that the only responsible thing I can do with what I know is put it somewhere it can be found. Wilderfell is in a valley, a proper one, steep-sided, running north to south, with a river at the bottom that is a stream in August and a serious animal in April. 2,000 feet of hillside on either side, bracken and scree, and on the west flank, a plantation of Sitka that the Forestry Commission put in during the 60s and that has never been thinned and is now the darkest place within 40 miles. The camp occupies the flat ground at the north end. 14 buildings, a playing field, a low ropes course, a swimming pond fed off the river, and 1,100 meters of dry stone wall that I have personally rebuilt sections of every summer for 22 years. It is beautiful. I need you to understand that whatever else I tell you, that place is beautiful, and the children who come here are happy, and I have never in 22 years met one who did not want to come back. We take 160 a session, 4 sessions a summer, 640 children a year. In 22 years, that is a little over 14,000 children. Nobody has ever been seriously hurt at Camp Wilderfell. Not once. Not one fracture. Not one hospital transfer for anything worse than a suspected appendix that turned out to be nothing. In 22 years, in a residential camp with a river, a swimming pond, a ropes course, and a mountain, we have recorded 11 sprains, 400 and something insect bites, and a great deal of homesickness. Our insurers have queried it twice. The first time in 2011, they sent an assessor because they thought we were underreporting, and he spent 4 days here and went through everything and wrote a report calling us exemplary. The second time in 2019, they sent somebody else, and she found nothing and put us on a lower premium band, and I said thank you, and I signed the form. I am telling you our safety record first because it is the evidence, and everything else I say is only the story I have built around it. Here is what I know. In the summer of my third year, in 2006, a girl of 11 called Nan Ferretti went into the Sitka plantation on the west flank on the second Thursday of the second session at some point between 4 and 6 in the afternoon and did not come out. We had her missing for 9 hours. I am not going to dress that up. It is the worst night of my life, and I have had some competition. 160 children on site and a missing 11-year-old and a plantation that Mountain Rescue described when they arrived at 9 as the most difficult ground they worked in that year. Sitka planted at 2-meter spacing and never thinned is not a forest. It is a solid object with gaps in it. You cannot walk in it. You cannot see 4 meters. Sound does not travel. A child in there is not lost. A child in there is inside something. We found her at 3 in the morning, or rather, she came out. That is what I have written in every report I have ever filed, and it is true. At 8 minutes past 3, Nan Ferretti walked out of the tree line onto the top field in her camp shirt and 1 shoe. Uninjured, unscratched, not hypothermic, not distressed. She was checked at the district hospital that night and discharged at 9 in the morning with a note that said no injuries observed, well hydrated, well oriented, well hydrated. 9 hours in a plantation in July. I sat with her in the ambulance and I asked her, in the way you are supposed to, whether anybody had been with her. And she said yes. And I said, who? And she said, a lady who lives in there. And then she said, she asked me to ask you something. I said, what did she ask? And Nan Ferretti, 11 years old, in an ambulance with a blanket round her and a woman from Mountain Rescue holding her hand, said, she wants to know if you'll take one a year instead. Then she said, I said I'd ask. And then she said, is that all right? And she looked worried. And I said, yes, love, that's fine. You did the right thing. And she fell asleep. She has no memory of it. I have checked twice at a distance and appropriately. She is 30 now. She came to our 20th anniversary and she was lovely and she remembers being lost and remembers nothing else at all. I did not answer that question in 2006. I want to be precise about this. Nothing was agreed in that ambulance. I said, yes, love, that's fine, you did the right thing, to a frightened child, about the asking, not about the thing asked. I have gone over that sentence for 19 years, in the dark, and I know exactly what I said and exactly what I meant, and I know that it does not matter at all. Because here is what happened next. Nothing. For 3 years, nothing. Camp ran, children came, our safety record was ordinary. 2 fractures in 2007, a boy with a serious asthma attack in 2008 who went out by air ambulance and was fine. A counselor who broke a collarbone in 2009. And then, in the autumn of 2009, I lost something. Not a child. My mother died in the November. She was 81, and it was not a shock, and it was, as these things go, gentle. And in 2010, our accident book was empty, completely. 1 full season, 640 children, and the only entries were insect bites. In 2011, my brother's marriage ended and his son stopped speaking to him for 4 years, and our accident book was empty. In 2012, I was diagnosed with the thing I still have, and which is now, finally, the reason I am closing. In 2013, my dog was killed on the Valley Road. In 2014, my oldest friend, who had been the camp cook for 11 years, had the stroke that took her speech. Every year since 2010. One thing every year always in the winter, always mine, always someone or something in my life, and never a child on this site. 14 consecutive years and not one serious injury at Camp Wilderfell. I know how this sounds. I know precisely how this sounds, and I have had 19 years to consider the obvious reading, which is that a woman in her 60s with a chronic illness and an ordinary allotment of grief has drawn a line around it and called it a bargain. That is a very good explanation. It accounts for everything except the accident book, because the accident book is not subjective. It is a bound volume with numbered pages in a locked drawer, and it has been inspected 4 times by 3 different bodies, and the numbers in it are, for a camp of this size, in this terrain, over this period, statistically absurd. I have had a friend who teaches statistics look at it without telling her why, and she said the words that made me finally decide to write this down. She said, "Petra, this isn't a good safety record. This is a place where nothing is allowed to happen." Her name is not Petra. I have changed it. She has children. Now I will tell you the hardest part, and then I will stop. I have gone into the plantation 11 times, over 19 years, always in the winter, always alone, always with somebody knowing where I was, because I am not a fool. I have never found anything. Not a structure, not a clearing, not a mark. It is 200 hectares of Sitka at 2-meter spacing, and it is one of the most hostile environments I have ever put my body into. And there is nothing in it but trees and dead needles and a dark that starts about 11 meters in. The 11th time was 3 years ago. I was 65, and I should not have been in there. And I got about 400 meters in, and I sat down with my back against a trunk because I could not get any further. And I said out loud into a plantation in February, with nobody within a mile, "I want to renegotiate." I said, "I'm ill. I'm going to close it. And when I close it, there won't be any children here for you to not hurt. And there won't be anything left of mine for you to take. And I don't know what happens then, and I would like to know what happens then." I sat there for about 40 minutes, and nothing answered, because of course nothing answered. And I got out before dark with a torn coat and a bruised hand. And in the following winter, my sister was diagnosed. She is fine now. She had the surgery, and she is fine. And she does not know that I sat in a wood and offered to renegotiate 11 weeks before her scan. That is the whole of it. That is everything I have. Next Friday, I am handing the keys to the trust that has bought the site. They are going to run it as an outdoor education center for adults, corporate work mostly, and some teacher training. No residential children. That was a condition of sale, and I paid for that condition with about 400,000 pounds of value, and I would have paid 10 times that. I have not told them anything. I want that on the record, too, because it is the part one am least able to defend. I have written this instead, and I have left a copy in the office safe with a letter, and if they open it, they open it. Here is the last thing, and then I am going to go and lock up. I do not think it is evil. I have never once in 19 years felt that. I think something has been in that plantation a long time, longer than the trees, longer than the camp, and I think in 2006, a child wandered into it, and it noticed her, and I think what it wanted was very simple and very terrible and entirely ordinary. It wanted a share, and it did not take her. It could have. It had 9 hours and 200 hectares and an 11-year-old girl in one shoe, and at 8 minutes past 3 in the morning, it walked her back out to the edge of the top field and sent her to me with a question. It asked, "That is the thing I have never been able to get past. In 19 years of being quietly billed every single winter for a debt I never formally agreed to, the fact remains that it asked first, and it asked politely, and it accepted my answer, and it has honored its side without a single failure for 14,000 children. I do not know what I am. I have thought about it every night since 2009, and I have never landed anywhere. I have not hurt anybody. Everything that has been taken from me, except my friend's speech and my sister's year, and those two are why I do not sleep. 14,000 children have come up that valley road and gone home again, whole, and some of them were coming from houses I would not describe to you, and for 2 weeks a summer, they were somewhere that nothing was allowed to happen to them. I have decided that is worth what it cost. I made that decision in about 2011, and I have made it again every year since, in the winter, when the bill comes. But I want to say one thing to whoever finds this, and it is the only thing here that is a warning rather than a confession. Next Friday, the children stop coming, and I do not know whether something that has spent 19 years being paid on time, in full, without complaint, by one woman who never once tried to get out of it, will understand that the arrangement has ended. Or whether it will simply wait, the way it waited before 2006, in 200 hectares of unthined Sitka on the west flank of a valley in the north, and count out its year, and come looking in the winter for the share it is owed. I will be gone by then, most likely. That is not courage, it is arithmetic. My consultant and I have had that conversation. So if you are reading this, and it is a winter, and you have taken this place on, and something in your life has gone wrong in a way that feels like weather rather than accident, then I am sorry, and I want you to know two things. The first is that it will not hurt anyone on this site. It never has. Whatever else it is, it keeps its word. And the second is that it asks. It always asks. It sent a child out of a wood at 3 a.m. rather than come to the door itself, and it waited 19 years for an answer it had already decided to accept. So if it asks you, answer carefully. And if you can, if you have it in you, and I could not, I want you to try something I never had the courage to try. In 19 years of paying, without ever once opening my mouth. Say no. Say no. See what happens. And write it down. Because I have run a camp for 22 years on the strength of a yes I never actually gave, and I am closing it without ever finding out whether any of it was necessary. That is the thing that will be with me at the end. Not the bill. Not the winters. That I never asked what the alternative was. I just paid every year in the dark, quietly, and told myself it was for the children. It was. It was also easier than finding out.